Hi everybody, I am Candidate Master Khanya Mazibuko from ThinkChess, and today we'll be looking at a very interesting position, which we'll be dealing with attacking on opposite sides. The interesting thing about attacking on opposite sides is that it gives more attacking possibilities whereby both sides will try to get an attack on their opponent's king, and whoever is usually the first one to break through is most likely usually the winner. Let's take a look at a few examples. So, in this game right here, we just played between Firmston, Michael Phillips, and Matchett HG, which was played as the Stevenson Memorial in the year 1959, which started off by e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6. This is the Sicilian defense, a very aggressive opening whereby white tries to open up his queenside pieces and try to get a control of the important d4 square by using his knight on c6 and pawn on c5. So white tries to open up the center with the move d4 and getting all of his pieces active and ready to get into the game. C takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, and knight c3. Pawn to d6. This is the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, which is actually known for its very flexible system, as it can not only transpose to many types of Sicilians, like the Sicilian dragon, which is characterized by pawn to g6, or the knight off defense, or the Scheveningen, which also is pawn to e6 or pawn to a6. These are all different setups whereby black tries to control the center using all of these pieces except for his pawns. Let's see how the game continues. Pawn to f3 by white, protecting the important e4 square. Pawn to g6, now announcing that we are actually going to be heading into the Sicilian dragon. Bishop to e3, over protecting the knight on d4. Bishop g7, queen d2, short castle, and finally bishop to c4. Now, white already has gotten out all of his minor pieces and is finally ready to castle long. Black tries to develop his queenside, bishop to d7, and after long castles, we can actually have a look at this position now. You would actually realize that both sides have calmly castled and almost all their pieces are active. But in this hindsight, if you look at white's pawn structure, which is the pawn structure on the king's side, which starts off from e4, f3, g2, and h2, you'd realize that actually these pawns are stopping white from actually launching a really huge attack on the white pieces. So, as we now understand that, you'll understand why white will actually try to do a pawn storm, allowing him to actually open up more lines and more files in order to enter the black camp. Black continues, rook c8, with an x-ray attack on the bishop on c4. So white has to protect it, bishop to b3, and then finally knight a5. This move, actually trying to go and get the bishop on b3, is actually a really good move, but at the same time, it kind of wastes time. Like I said, when positions whereby opposite castling has occurred, it is always essential to try to get the attack running and rolling. The idea of trying to take the bishop on b3, which is an important attacking piece for white, is good, but sometimes a bit too slow. In this position, white calmly ignored the threat and gold, went g4, trying hard to play pawn to h4, and then trying to open up the position with pawn to h5. Black continued, knight takes b3, check, and obviously a takes b3. Now, whenever you have a scenario whereby you have to capture a pawn, always try to capture your pawns towards the center so that you have more pawns which are actually closer towards the center, making it a bit harder for your opponent to put his pieces on central squares. So as after a move like a takes b3, the square c4 is now protected, which is actually a key square in black's attack. queen a5, threatening queen a1 check. So white defends it, king b1, and now finally b5. Black finally trying to realize the fact that he wants to be opening up lines and pieces on the queen side in order for his attack to be successful. Now, white plays a nice and common idea in this position right here. Whenever a king is on b1 and the queen on d2 in this setups, and the queen on a5 not being protected, a move which is really typical and very thematic in this position is actually knight to d5. This tricky little move actually offers the queen trade, but unfortunately does not end so well for black. If black plays queen takes d2, then a move like knight takes e7 check, a nice Zwischenzug or an in-between move, means that white will be pawn up after king h8 and rook takes d2. So that's why black has to play queen to d8. Knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now h4. Finally getting his attack on the way. White is also trying hard to get his pieces and open files open so that they are actually targeting the black king. Queen to c7, moving the queen for the third time, but unfortunately, due to this waste of time, pawn to h5, and white is the first one to open up the position. Pawn to e5, black tries hard to strike in the center, but this doesn't prove actually successful enough to stop the attack. Knight e2, bishop on e6, knight to c3, attacking the important b5 pawn and trying to protect the c2 pawn so that white could actually take the d6 pawn. b4, knight b5, hitting the queen, queen a5, and then h takes g6. A killer move, leaving the knight on b5 under attack. But what did white see? After the move queen takes b5, I want you to think for yourself right now. After having sacrificed the piece, white has a very strong move in this position right here. Can you quickly find it? I hope you were successful and seeing that the h file is actually the key important role in this attack. So in this position right now, a move like queen h2 is very deadly as it threatens mate on h7 and does not actually leave black with a lot of defenses. Black tries to open up room for the king to run because h7 is almost impossible to defend. Rook f to d8, then slowly but surely the pieces start coming in. Queen takes h7 check, king f8, bishop h6 check, king e7, and finally removing the last defender in the black position, which is the f7 pawn, g takes f7. And if we look at this position right now, black is a whole piece up, but unfortunately I don't think his piece will be alive. His king will actually live to tell the day of this whole battle. After bishop takes f7, g5, bringing in more and more pieces into the attack. Queen to d2, a sneaky little move by black trying to attack the weak c2 square, but after g takes f6 check, king e8, bishop d2, a silent but quietly deadly move which protects c2 by blocking the attack with the queen. Rook takes c2, black getting a bit desperate, trying to open up the position and try to get some counterplay in, but after a move like queen h8, king d7, and queen h2 check, king back to e8, king takes c2, is unfortunate that in this position, rook c8 is not a possibility because the queen on h3 is guarding that important square. And after, say, queen a6, bishop takes b4, rook c8 check, king to b1, bishop to b3. Then in this position right now, white played a move and black resigned on the spot. Would you find the killer move, which simplifies into a winning endgame, which allows white to actually realize his material advantage? And yes, I'm sure you found it. Queen takes c8, sacrificing the queen in order to win that position after queen takes c8, rook to h8 check, and not only would white remain a whole rook up, but with the winning advantage in the end. Let's look at another game. In the next game, which was played by Ruminen against Max Uwe in the year 1934 at the Leningrad tournament, we see another typical idea again of opposite side castling. The opening started off as an English attack, not one of the most aggressive openings, but play builds up sharply later on after e5, knight c3, knight to c6, knight to f3, knight to f6, pawn to d4. It's not so much relevant as to the first couple of moves, but as the play continues, we realize something now. After bishop b4, bishop d2, white castles short, and then after bishop g2, controlling this long diagonal with his bishop, pawn to f4, trying to open up the position because white is still a bit behind in development. White finds an interesting idea. Knight to d5. The strong bishop on b4 is really better than the bishop on d2. So Ruminen realizes this key point and tries to exchange black's only active piece after the move. Bishop to d6, bishop to c3, putting that bishop on a better diagonal, rook to b8, now queen d3, announcing to black that he might be looking at a possibility of going on the queen side. Now, in this position, queen g5 was played, which is not so accurate. The problem is, after realizing that white might not be going on to the king side, it is essential for you to actually start your counterplay as quick as possible, because the key fundamental rules in opposite side castling is that the first one to attack is usually the one who's most successful. After queen g5, pawn to h4, kicking that queen from the correct square on the nice square, queen to h6, and finally pawn to g4, already initiating the attack on the black position, and realizing that same principle again, whereby attacking is almost key and important in order for you to obtain a serious advantage. Knight to c5, hitting the queen, queen d2, pawn to b6. Again, quiet but also slow move. This move prepares the development of the bishop on c8, which is pretty good, but at the same time, it does not really open lines on the queen side. So it's not so clear that actually black has any prospect of actually getting a good attack. White, very happy to see such a move, throws his king to the queen side with long castle, bishop to b7, then finally pawn to g5, attacking the queen on h6, queen e6, and queen d4, threatening queen takes g7, checkmate, queen f7 to defend the mate, and then pawn to h5. Notice how persistent white is when it comes to his attack. He does not waste any time into opening up the position. He does not have regard of positional factors, like, for example, is the bishop on g2 a good piece? Or in examples of, is tactics like knight takes c7 working? Because he understands a key fundamental point, that opening up the position and getting the pieces into the attack is the best way to try to generate a winning advantage. Knight to e6, queen to d3, knight back to c5, and instead of repeating with queen back to d4, now white finds queen to d2, a really modest move, pawn to f3, and then a nice in-between move, pawn to g6, breaking open the gates of the black position. In this situation now, the black king is very uncomfortable now. This pawn sack not only opens up the h file, but opens up the g file and allows both the rooks from h1 and d1 to administer a huge aggressive attack on the defenseless black king. Queen f4, trying hard not to open up lines. Black does not take any material, and in fact offers the queen with queen to f4. But after knight takes f4, bishop takes f4, pawn to e3, pawn takes g2, rook h4. This is almost really hard to defend because black is now queen down, and it is actually very evident that he will be opening up the g file and the h file with moves like pawn to h6, or even the simple g takes h7. Rook to g5, g takes h7 check, king takes g7, queen c2, now seeing the potential of the queen on this cute diagonal from b1 to h7, and the strong bishop on c3 to g7. We see that it becomes very evident that this position is lost after moves like f4. And bishop f3, rook takes g2 leads to resignation by black. Unfortunately, there are too many threats in this position. As much as black can take the rook on d1 or the rook on g2, those will not help as there are too many attacking positions looking at the black king and not enough defenders. Another key attacking idea is do not stop and worry about material gains if the attack has showing promise. For example, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces into the attack, whilst all the defending pieces do not coordinate well to actually stop it. And after, say, a move like bishop takes g2, queen takes g2, it is really hard to defend the threats on the g file, which is understandable why black actually resigned. Let's look at the last example, one of my favorites. So in this position here, we are going to go into a Scandinavian or a center counter, which starts off with the moves e4, d5, e takes d5. Now, the idea of the center counter is to actually get the pieces out as quickly as possible and actually get in a very aggressive position with alongside castles. And white, being a very strong player, actually accepts this challenge with e takes d5, knight to f6, pawn to d4, and now queen to d5. Yes, breaking the principle of bringing a queen out too early, but this factor is actually slightly minor because this queen actually does find some useful squares in the middle game as much as it gets kicked in the opening. So, knight to f3, bishop to g4, bishop to e2, and now knight to c6. Already getting ready for longside casting. Strong queen on d4 is standing in a really good position, so white already immediately kicks it off with the move of c4, and after queen to h5, protects the center with bishop to e3. Black continues. Long castle. White continues, knight to d2, knight b to d2, pawn e6, and castles. And again, we've got that typical position again. Both sides are castled in opposite positions, and it's now time to get the attack rolling. Now, there are many ways to do so. As you have seen, we are trying to open up lines and open up the position and allow our pieces to actually get into our opponent's camp by trying to open up lines towards that side, the side where your opponent has castled. So in this position right now, as much as it does not look clear, white actually wants to open up the queen side with maybe sacrificing the pawn, with maybe pawn to b4, as seen in the game. The game continued, pawn to g5, trying to get the queen maybe to a better diagonal after, say, queen to g6 and get pawn to h5. But unfortunately, this is not fast enough. Queen a4, getting the queen closer and closer to the black king. Bishop d6, attacking the very key point h2 in this position. But unfortunately, after a move like g3, it's not so clear that black can break through in time, as now we can see a huge problem in the position. all of black's pieces are ahead of the pawns, making it hard to open up or actually even open up the position by pushing the pawns forward. That's actually very vital. In opposite side castling, whenever we get a position whereby we can want to throw our pawns into our opponent's camp, it's much better to have our pieces behind the pawns instead of in front of them, or else it would decrease the mobility of the pawns. So in this position, rook goes to g1, trying still hard to protect the g pawn. Pawn to b4, thematically sacrificing the pawn and opening up the b file, allowing the white pieces to enter the camp. Now, in this position right now, black played an interesting idea of actually accepting this pawn, and actually didn't last so long after that. Rook a b1, already putting the rook into an active position. Bishop takes d2, and now in this position right here, I want you to find the killing move, which opens up the black camp and gets in a decisive attack. I hope you found the interesting idea, which starts off with an incredible rook takes b7, and unfortunately, it's really hard to play on. Let's say in a position after king takes b7, we run into the idea of queen to b5, king to c8, and after say queen to a6. There's some nasty threats which come with pawn to c5 and even bishop to a6, and the black king unfortunately is running out of squares. As you can see now, the attack is really fast because of a simple idea of having enough open lines. So black, seeing all of this, doesn't take that, tries to complicate the position too, takes on f3, but now finally cutting the queen from the defense of the whole position, because in this position, let's say after g5, the queen would want to swing back on a5 to try to defend the position. White actually finds an interesting idea, which is pawn to d5 now, and unfortunately, after this bishop into the attack, having also allowing no protection to come from the queen side from black, it becomes very evident that this is almost completely lost. Black tries one last move, knight to g4, but after a nice little tactic by white, which I'm sure you can spot, we realize that a move like rook takes c7 just finishes the game. After king takes c7, queen to c6 check, king to b8, now rook to b1 is curtains. A very classical and interesting plan by white at its easiest and most simplest form. I hope you guys found this lesson very instructive, and always realize that attacking can be done with many ways, especially one could always look for positions whereby he has to castle long. Thank you so much for this lesson. This is Khanya Mazibuko.